another quick post-processing tip for you today, and this tip is all about helpers which you can use to control the dynamic range while working on the image. So to see if you're losing shadows or if you're losing highlights. For example, the histogram is great. It gives you a good indication of how the tonal values are distributed, but if you're working on image, applying contrast and tonal adjustments, there might be a point where you lose some dark areas or white areas and you don't instantly recognize it when looking at an image. So now I'll show you two things you can do to help you control those areas. For example, here's the color sampler tool, which I'd set to like 3 versus 3 average, and now I would look for the very dark areas in an image and set a marker there. To find those dark areas, I'd use a levels adjustment. Hold down Alt and click on this dark triangle here, and while moving to the right, you'll recognize that areas in the image start to get black, and those areas are the darkest areas in the image. So when I move this to the right, I remember where those dark areas were, was this part here, and I place one marker here. See, this is a very dark area, and you'll now have this marker 1 here in this area, in this info area, and those are quite low values, but it's not black, it's like a shade of gray, a very dark shade of gray. And I keep this one up here, and during my post-processing I can look at this value and see if it's gotten too dark. But I'll not only use one of those markers, I'll place 2 markers for the dark values which I want to preserve. For example, you see down here there's another area which gets dark very fast, so I'll place another marker here. It's marker number 2. I might need to adjust it to have it at the darkest part. Alright. So with those 2 markers, number 1 and number 2, I can control the very dark areas in the image. Oops, wrong direction. But I also want to control the bright areas. So again, I use this levels helper, and now I pick up this white triangle, also holding down Alt, and when I move it to the left, you see that specific parts in the image get bright first, and those are the brightest areas. For example, this wave here tends to get white very fast if I increase the contrast, so I'll put a marker number 3 there. And also up in the clouds, let's see again, there are also areas which get bright very fast, and I put another marker there. Then I can throw away this levels adjustment, and I have my markers in place. 1 and 2 for 2 dark values, and 3 and 4 for the bright areas. And if I now use curves or adjustments, I can look at those markers and see how the tones are affected. But there's another nice helper. For example, if you're using Lightroom, you know that you can switch on some warnings there if you have tones that are too bright in an image or tones that are too dark, and you can have something similar here in Photoshop. So what you need to do, you need a gradient map. This is usually just a black-white map, but if I click on this gradient map, I can select this red-green, for example. I click OK, and now I double-click on this layer here to the right, and I can now use those settings of the underlying layer to reveal the areas again, and I'd move this to around 10 or 5, the white slider, and then move the black slider up to around 245 or 250 in this area. And I'll now show you what this does. Currently you see nothing because the image doesn't contain so those bright areas. Oh, maybe you see already. Let's look at this. Here no, there's nothing. Okay. We first need to do some adjustments so you see the effect. I'd usually leave this gradient map. I call it, I don't know, some tonal helper or something. Doesn't matter. I'll put this always on top of everything, and now I do my adjustments below this helper. For example, let's use the levels again, or curves. Let's use the curves and apply a very strong contrast, darkening the darker areas and brightening the brighter areas. And now you see the effect similar to what you have in Lightroom. Now red are the areas which are darker than the value we set here. For example, here it's 8. So everything which you now see red in the image will have a tonal value below 8. And also here the green areas, everything that's green in the image will have a value that's larger than 247. And with this little helper, this is a great tool to control your image, to control the dynamic range and make sure that you don't lose detail. For example, after making this contrast adjustment, I just use a brush, a black brush with like 20% opacity, and draw here in this curves layer mask to remove this adjustment in those areas where the clouds are getting too bright. Or down here also, I just paint over this to remove this adjustment layer's effect there, also here in the dark areas. So this helps us great. And if I deactivate it, I could also just use those ones. So both combined give you a great control over the tonal range in your image, much better than looking at the histogram would be, or for example just looking at the image.